worked with like the Aragon team or any of the other big teams that are building out DAO primitives, basically. There was a catalyst sensing idea dropped this morning called No Governance Primitives, and it's talking about how to build up a catalog of basically smart contract scripts that represent different primitives. I think that relates really closely to this topic today.
Hi, Vincent. He wrote it.
Yeah, I didn't want to plug my own idea, but thank you for plugging it, Rory.
Okay, I'm plugging it because I saw it this morning and I was like, yeah, this is something we need to talk about. And I think it's really important to clarify that when I talk about DAOs, I'm talking about on-chain smart contract driven stuff, not like Catalyst. Some people call it a DAO, and that just kind of raises my hackles because it's not. It's a bunch of people that are decentralized, but there's no smart contracts to decentralize the actual legal kind of relationships between people and how funds are distributed. So talking about like financial primitives, because we need to figure out how to distribute money, figure out like, are we going to do loans? Are we going to do direct grants? Are we going to do payouts? Are we going to do some kind of DeFi? Those primitives are useful, and being able to assemble them like Lego blocks based on your needs is really, really important. And then the governance primitives, like how do we decide what we're going to do when we have a treasury? Who does it? How do we pay out? What do those things look like? Because I was having a conversation this morning, like the current Catalyst proposal funding model is one thing, but that doesn't work for everybody. If you are going to quit your job and do something, you can't be funded for a 3-month thing and then hope that your next stage gets funded, because if it doesn't, then you're screwed. So we need to also enable models where we have, okay, you're part of this DAO, you have a salary for the next 2 years, we're going to try to do something. And if it succeeds, we all succeed. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So you can plan out your time and commit to something for longer terms of time. So having all those different kinds of primitives are super important. And that's why I wanted to join this conversation today, because I think
I'll echo what you said about,
I'll
echo what you said about you can't expect to just quit your job and have your income be based on this little short-term proposal. And that goes double when we see the scale of funding level that proposals are actually receiving. Most of them are like 4,000, 6,000, 8,000. And that doesn't pay the bills for more than a couple months for folks in this country where I'm sitting.
Yeah, it'd be nice to be able to say, okay, we're going to treat this almost like VC and say, this DAO concept has a really good idea. We're going to give it $5 million of funding, and then have Cardano Foundation fund 10 of these and hope that one of them is super successful and expect the other 9 to just kind of fail. That model,
have that be okay.
Yeah, have it be okay. Or it could be a model where CF loans money to a DAO, and then as it becomes economically viable, it pays back that loan, so it's able to scale its own operations even further without doing a direct grant and have the money just disappear into void. It generates return and value to the whole ecosystem. So there's lots of different things that I'd love to see, like DAO primitives, and build out a library of this is how we can assemble things and make it easy, because I don't think we should be reinventing it.
I can speak to like what I was thinking about that idea. It's totally, exactly what you're saying. Like it's being able to kind of modularize a lot of the stuff so you can represent these more complicated governance systems and funding mechanisms from a set of standardized primitives. And my big thing, and we've been talking about this a couple weeks ago, is like the scope of the DAO and also the insurance of the DAO. And how can you formalize, I guess if you're talking about funding somebody for like $5 million, and I had seen one proposal where somebody wanted to buy a DGX server for Cardano for like $30,000. It's like, well, who owns that? What are you even going to use it for? How do you get access to it? And so how do you formalize all of that? And especially if you're going to be giving someone enough money to where they'd be opening like an office and they have resources, who owns those resources, that kind of thing. It gets really complicated, right? And I felt like there was no good set of formally verifiable primitives that would allow kind of like autonomous regulation of the organization. You end up basically relying on one or two people to kind of pull everything together no matter what. And there's no way to verify. They're not contractually obligated in any way to do certain things, which I thought was just kind of weird. So that's kind of where that came from. But I love the idea of this DAO of these patterns, because primitives are only useful if Legos are only useful if you can build certain things out of them, right? So you need a certain number of shapes in order to form something. So like I'm looking at these patterns, like what primitives do you need to be able to create an effort-based contributions network? It's really interesting. I don't know what primitives, like what does a primitive have to have in order to do that? And if you assemble them, what properties of that network exist? Like if you look at it and you study it, what does it do? I don't know. I think this my idea was definitely more baseline. It's like, what are the pieces? What are the Lego blocks at a very fundamental, almost like a research level that you can use with formally verifiable pieces, like a smart contract, a wallet, and a function, a Lambda function. Can you build and create in what would that standard look like? Almost like a standards document. It's very dry. It's almost like USB-C standard, right? Like you can implement it any way you want, but it must have, or ERC20, like a primitive must have this in order for you to assemble a DAO out of it. And your DAO is not considered standard unless it's built of primitives that meet TBD, right? But the actual DAOs are these patterns that Pete showed here. And so the primitives have to be able to build these, which I think is really cool. So having this library, I think, is really valuable to make sure the primitives are on track.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear like the interest that's here, and that there's a similar kind of energy. I'm gonna do a screen share and look at, so now we've got some recording going on. Set a little context and just give sort of a comparison of sort of what I had in my head, and it doesn't have to stick here. I just want to show you where I got started at. So like I said, when I was in the Agile space, or I still am, like we map out like different places where organizations interact together. And then we also map out the different sizes of impacts. So things that apply to teams, that apply to teams of teams, entire organizations, and impact. And what we started doing was cataloging all the practices. So for this area at this level, you have a certain set of practices. And so it ended up leading to this kind of collection of maps. If we go over to the website here. So under the playbook, you can take a look at like team practices. And so basically what I have is like guidance and then a bunch of different techniques and ways that you can do this. So there's many different ways that you could do any one particular technique. And so my thought was that, you know, if you all are interested, that could be the same kind of thing. We have this, like I said, this primitives. And so I started this document over here, this sort of library of DAO, and looking at what were the common things that I was hearing being discussed, and that we could maybe branch it out. So the idea at the top of components is about the taxonomy. And so it's about defining what those different components are without defining solutions. And then down below in the area of patterns, it's then under each of these different things. So we have like distribution of equity, or allocation of equity, and then effort-based contributions. And so here's some patterns about effort-based contributions and distribution of equity. So splits between founders. Here's another technique called slicing pie. Million Monkeys was my company. I ended up folding it, but I did that about a decade ago, and we had a couple different revenue splitting scenarios that we used. And there's other ones for strategic decision making, as well as things that need to be fleshed out. But as far as how do you distribute funds, so the same thing you were talking about before, you know, as far as how do we do funding or allocation, you know, get money, should we do loans, tiered release of funds, all that kind of stuff are all things that sort of seem to fit into this category. So there's that. The other thing that I'll sort of do the show and tell, the other link on here before we get started, is this one over here. So this is based off of a governance model I wrote a while back. This is just the latest version of it. So I was looking at how to craft a conscious capitalist organization and documenting a bunch of different practices that would go into it. I started mapping it out into a Miro board. Sort of discovered there's about 5 different components in my view. But again, just as a starting place. So I just want to put these out as certain ideas and discussing. And this Miro board uses a technique called current reality maps. It comes from lean theory of constraints type of thinking, where each of the red boxes outlines a particular problem that needs to be solved. And then the white boxes then link into different things you can do in order to solve that problem and address that. So not trying to say that we need to do one format or another, but I'll just toss it right there as far as setting the ground scope here. What do you all, what catches your eye? What would you like to do? And we can certainly do multiple things simultaneously. But I'll go ahead and take a pause now.
I can't use hands. And the components you have open right now, to me, it seems interesting place to start because I can already see a few things that kind of apply, but not really. But when, like if we go, like now, I think based on the components, we could actually think about what is the scope we want to solve right now? Do we want to help the project catalyst process and then pick the components what most apply here and then go a deep dive and choose a pattern, I guess. Maybe you can guide on there. Or what is the scope? I think would be perhaps to start from there. And maybe the Miro board is actually helpful to choose the scope.
Yeah, you mean like your original Miro board in the original?
I mean yours. Like
Oh, okay.
Like what could because we can take any of this, but it would be maybe more playful if we take a particular system we already know or want to create and then select component for there. So are we want to create some kind of new DAO in like, let's say this group we have in here, do we want to create a DAO? And what is the scope of that? Let's say we are representing Project Catalyst itself. And now we have 100,000 data to spread across all the community, and we have these 200 proposals. How do we start? And if that's the okay experimental scope, unless somebody else has something else in mind.
I think I'm go for it, Derek.
Oh, okay.
With or without smart contracts? Sorry.
With.
Okay. I think I can speak to scope, and this is something that I've just come across in all of my reading of DAOs and the problems of governance in general. I don't think, and this is a thesis, I can't prove this. I do not think you can define scope external to the actual implementation of the DAO. In every government structure, scope is effectively determined by its leaders in like existing governing structures, right? So people might say that a project has only scope, and Pete, you've done Agile. I think all of us have been on software projects where, a project manager can tell us what the scope is. That doesn't always actually be the truth, right? It can change over time, and that change control is sometimes also very arbitrary. Even if there is a change control system, sometimes that becomes arbitrary. I don't think that'll work for a DAO though, because then you're effectively building a system. I'm not convinced you can build a DAO that can have an exogenous scope defined for it. I think the DAO must be defined by its implementation, hence the primitives. That's kind of that's my thesis. Like the primitives of the DAO, the actual implementation of the DAO must define its scope. So So like when you say like building a DAO for Catalyst, what is Catalyst? It's like a treasury, it's proposers that are effectively like wallets and maybe IDs or something like that, right? So I think you have to have a set of actions that are acting on people and define that. And then that is the scope. And if you want to expand or contract the scope, you have to do that via these relations, these explicit relations, not necessarily that you can define it outside. I don't know. That's my thesis. I don't know if it's possible.
So, I mean, look, one thing which I think is quite interesting is that at the end of the day, a DAO is about assigning actions or tasks to people, and those people have the ability to do it or not, right? And then at the result of the task is either it's done and there's maybe a quality of that work to be done, and then on the other side of the equation, so that's like the resolution of the work, and the other side of the equation is discovery of the work. Like what is the problem, scoping the problem. So it's not our job necessarily to kind of scope the problem. It's our job to create the system that accurately scopes the problem, right? So I think that's kind of what you're calling to some extent. But the scope, at least for me, is that people at the end of the day need to know that they've been tasked to do something, and if it's something that they don't want to do, then they should be compensated for that. And the people who are benefiting from the problem being solved are the ones that should be, transfer value from the people who are benefiting to the people who are actually getting it resolved. So, and that's, what you can call fair. So, I mean, the scope is sort of like a fair model of value exchange. I know that's very broad strokes, but, to some extent, that's why I think we're all realizing that Agile is kind of, there's something in amongst that basically calls to what we're trying to achieve in the DAO. And it's, it's project management, but then it's also the other side of the market. It's kind of like problem discovery and scoping, and then associating with the individual actions in that to people's ability or people who are able, and then, tracking that they actually get it done. And then obviously on the resolution of that, this whole process, the smart contract says, okay, cool. You are worthy of compensation, and these are the benefactors necessarily of the system. So, I mean, what do you agree to that though? Is that not does that not seem like the scope of a DAO?
I just don't think that those can be implemented in a decentralized. I think a lot of the language that we use to define organization and tasks and projects and teams in existing infrastructure is leadership driven. It's driven by formal power often, right? So people are explicitly given roles and they have to execute those roles to the best of their ability to the team, to keep people on task, to keep teams happy, etc. And a lot of the actions that they take are not explicitly defined. They have a lot of freedom to take a lot of actions that may or may not be in the best interest of the project, that may or may not be within what a lot of people that built the organization expect, right? So a CEO can do a lot of things. A team lead can do a lot of things to get their team to be more productive and more cohesive, and a lot of things to make them less so, and including like reviews and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that works for in-person traditional organizations. But when we talk about a decentralized organization, we talk about being able to formalize what people can do, how they can do it, and how the system's supposed to be run. I'm not sure if we can get away from the implementation of all of these activities. Even if it is very, very heavy to think about all the different routes in which you can act, or to be very, very obvious about where the vagaries are, right? So like if you say person X is going to be the Scrum leader, then that's fine. You can have a voting or an election system that elects a Scrum leader over a set of developers who are also chosen, and maybe have some kind of Oracle structure that looks at their contributions. But that becomes, you know what I'm saying? Like that, I think you have to have that kind of explicit definition where you either give a pool of responsibility via some explicit mechanism, and that person then has the freedom to act in a more traditional way, or you have a very explicit set of actions that either a person is doing and only are allowed to do with resources that are scoped by the DAO, or it's done automatically, right? People are being paid when an oracle says that their work is good. When commits or when a pull request is merged or something like that. When an artist artifact or a visualization actually gets published, something. I don't know. I don't know. I think that's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed is that all of these things really start to tie together. You know, for example, you know, you're describing a system that's used a lot inside of traditional organizations, and that's hierarchy based. But there are ways to do non-hierarchy based sort of organizations. There's not a lot of them out there right now to pull from. You know, the best is like there's some in the area that are called teal, you know, that have to do with these sort of try to deal with these non-hierarchical kinds of organization categories. One of the techniques that I found though is getting into, there's this idea, the list of prioritized problems, where if you separate out the problems to be solved from the way of solving those solutions, that becomes one of the ways that you can start to do some decentralization. And that anybody can put together and sort of list these problems, and then you have to create some kind of governance structure around figuring out what those problems are in what order. But you can basically create a list of here's the big things that we need to solve. In a traditional organization, that becomes something that's top down, and whoever's got hired by the CEO or whoever put the organization together, you know, have created this structure and assigned value to that. But it doesn't have to be an assignment type of role. And that's actually one of the ideas that I wouldn't mind seeing, you know, come into the Catalyst Circle, is that if the Catalyst Circle can come up with a list of problems that the industry needs to solve, and then the funds can then source, you know, pay for people to build solutions to those problems. And so if you have some kind of pairing between that, then you could have you can unlock, you know, you could start getting into tiered funding and unlocking things like, you know, if you are able to show that you can solve this problem, maybe you design some kind of metrics that show that, you know, whatever solution we build, you know, here's how we'll know whether or not this problem is being, you know, acted upon, or if this is getting better. And if you were able to show that you can drive those metrics in a certain direction, then you can unlock certain funding. And then it doesn't matter who's assigned to what. We don't need assignments at all. We can each come up with our own ideas, our own projects. And as long as we can move those metrics in the right direction, then we're accomplishing the goals of the community.
I think, I mean, picking up on Vincent's point where he said that a lot of primitives are based on management language. And I think if you start with problem sensing, you're already in the domain of management thinking. You need to start, in my view, in a DAO with identity. Like, who are you? Yeah. What are you? What do you want to be? Then you go on to problem sensing, because, or if you may not want to go on to problem sensing, because that may not be your identity. So if we're already at problem sensing, then we're already in a type of DAO.
Yeah, and just calling to that, I mean, what exactly do you associate with identity, right? It's not just some sort of digital key to who you are. It's a profile attached to that, right?
It's your culture.
Yeah, and you know, and what exactly does the profile include? But
Not individual identity. I think what he was talking about is the identity of the group. How does a group identify itself culturally?
Exactly, yeah. It's nothing to do with digital identity. It's about, it's the starting point of the origin of the DAO. Let's say you can have different types of DAO. You start with an identity because you start with the culture that defines you, and that culture that defines you will then influence what you value. And, you know, whether you are a business person, whether you're an artist, whether you are trying to make social change. So, but we've skipped this step and now we're on problem sensing. So we're already a type of DAO here. Sorry.
I think it's really interesting. And I'd love to make sure that if we're building primitives, that they have the flexibility to be able to define both group and individual identity on a more direct like a authentication realm, but also like what Stephen is saying on a cultural piece. Because I think mission and vision statement are really important. I've never been to a conference where that wasn't important. It seems like we've kind of, as a world, come to the agreement that mission and vision are really, really important. But I don't think anybody's talking about how you, as a DAO, create and modify that, right? Again, that's a very hierarchical thing. You know, the CEO comes down and this is our vision statement. This is our mission statement. This is our 250 characters that we're going to live by. This is our creed. That's interesting. I think that's a really interesting problem.
Again, this terminology of mission statement. Who makes a mission statement? A business makes a mission statement. A culture doesn't make a mission statement. A mission statement. The culture is its mission statement. The culture, its identity, defines its needs. It knows who it is, in a sense, and it has its needs. And that's the starting point of any distributed governance. The needs of a business define its identity. It's a business. It needs to be a business. So it will use that language, and then we're onto the language of business. Then we're into a type of DAO. But we could be another type of DAO. That's what I'm saying.
I'm wondering if we could have a little bit more of a. Could you give a little bit more of an explanation, Stephen, as to like an example, like specific example of another?
Yeah, I can relate it back to circles. Let's take the circles. The circles came up with problem sensing. Now, if you look at the circle meeting, some people reacted, different stakeholders reacted to that in different ways. So the Cardano Foundation and the IOG reacted to that in their own ways. But let's say tool makers and CAs, they said, oh, we're going to go back to our community and talk to our community about these problem sensors. We're not going to answer our problem sensors here. That is their culture. Okay, that is their culture. It's not that they're not saying, oh, we agree with this method that you've defined to us, that you've given to us. They're saying to you, oh, you want us to define problems. We're going to take that back to our culture and then ask what our culture think is the problem sensing. Okay, so tool makers and maintainers have a culture. They have an identity, and they have their own needs as well. And those needs are different from the needs of IOG and the Cardano Foundation, for example. And they will be a different kind of governance.
So, I mean, one thing which I think that I want to point out, that which is my appeal, or like why I think that a lot of people here kind of identify something in Agile. And I don't know if you guys have done like a full Agile course and you know what all the tiers are. So it's from task, epic, to initiative and vision. So who knows all of those levels? Most people, right? Is what I find interesting about it is that it is a hierarchy of planning, and businesses tend to build their hierarchies sort of alongside that. But actually, for example, some people are good at defining the vision and they think that way, and some people are good at resolving tasks and they think that way, right? So there's a task associated with the different level of the planning, which then businesses build these hierarchies on. But it doesn't like, you can't get away from the fact that that's how planning goes about, right? That there is those hierarchies. So even if we were to be decentralized, even at a cultural level, talking about the circles, when they say, okay, we're going to go back to our community, is because they don't have a vision yet, that they could say, okay, cool, we have a vision. We have to go and ask the community, and what's their vision, right? So, but they're still calling to that vision, a hierarchy of project planning. So I think, look, there's something there that I think is very sort of tangible, and it is hierarchical, but it doesn't mean that the organization, the DAO, has to be hierarchical. We could assign those tasks to individuals.
Yeah. I think one thing that I want to appreciate with what you're saying, Steve, and others, is that I'm big on a choose your own adventure kind of approach, and if the group wants to start by identifying identity first, great. I think eventually you might need to get to problem sensing or set some strategy, figure out what you're going to do, but that may not be the way that you start. And somebody else may start with problem sensing, and then they can find their identity later. I don't know that there's a definitive first step, like this has to be the first step. But every organization needs to identify their identity at some point, and they need to identify their strategy, and they need to understand the problems of the community they wish to support.
Yeah, I think it would be too
I would
much,
like to just point out is we're kind of trying to bring like corporate stuff into DAO and kind of translate one into another. And I think we have huge opportunities beyond that. And we've seen that with some of the Ethereum DAOs, like the big DAO hack. Back in that environment, a group of people had a funded treasury, they came around an idea, and then people would propose and vote on things. If a subset of that community didn't like where the majority was going, they could take all of their marbles and withdraw it and fork a DAO, basically, and create a smaller DAO based on a different purpose and vision. And they voted with their economic power to say, this is what we want to do. And if the parent organization, it probably isn't a parent, but if this greater organization splits into two communities, they just go in their own separate ways. And there were on-chain contractual mechanisms for that to happen. They would say, I'm forking a DAO, who wants to come with me because I don't believe in this mission. Here's a new mission. And then people could say, I agree, and their influence, their funds, however it works, their voting power, move to the other DAO, and a whole bunch of child DAOs started appearing. And that was kind of the whole core problem with the DAO hack that caused Ethereum to be reset, is somebody found out a way to exploit that with child DAOs and steal money that way. But putting aside bugs and stuff, I think looking at an organization not as an entity, but as a temporal agreement of people to do something is probably more valid, because that mission could change, and then a certain portion that people might decide to go do something else with the funds that they represent, essentially, or merge with another DAO because now they're kind of closer to this one. So it can be a very fluid organization structure, and we should allow for those kind of primitives to bud and branch and merge and do stuff, just so that it's not like our old ossified like corporate structure. And if you don't agree with that DAO, your only option is to quit and go find another one or start your own. I don't know if I want to carry on that kind of current paradigm kind of thinking. And we should use the capabilities of blockchain and what we can do to create new structures and new things.
I think
that often happens when the values of the people in a DAO are implicit, when communication is not happening properly, and then when the DAO is the people in the DAO are doing things for some time, and then suddenly that thing that was implicit becomes explicit in somebody's action, particularly a unilateral sort of action, right? And so if we can lift those bits of communication, those bits of vision, mission, into something that's explicit at the group level, then we can maybe guard against the situations that lead to people saying, screw it, I'm out. What do you think, Stephen?
So I'm just trying to address Pete's original point about, do we want to go back to identity? And my first reaction was no, because I don't want to interrupt your workshop, because of what you've got something here. All I wanted to point out that this is, as soon as you've got into the realm of agile type, let's call it that, or problem sensing, you're already into a type of DAO. Okay, that's what I'm saying, and that's okay. That may be okay. That may be what this workshop's about. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. If we're going to go back to identity, what I mean is culture, our ethics, our values, our beliefs, these things. These inform how we collaborate. Okay, and they inform what is meaningful to us as well. So I think you've already done that when you've gone to problem sensing and agile. DAO, because then you've got already a culture, which is a kind of a business culture, which has certain ethics, it has certain values, and it has certain beliefs of efficiency and of effectiveness of this kind of agile process, for example. It has a kind of vision of collaboration, which is already developed. So we're already into a type of DAO. That's all I'm saying. But if you want to, as we're talking about, generic DAOs aren't. I think Vincent was saying, yeah, I don't think there is such a thing as a generic DAO. It's like a kind of, the primitives are too wide. There's too many variables. It's like a process of discovery. And I think that's Aragon's approach as well. Like someone like Daniel Espina, his approach is to investigate what is there, not to prejudge what is there.
I think Noe brings up a really interesting thought,
Vincent,
and the
Ken put his
importance
hand
of
up.
being. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Pete.
Ken put his hand up.
Oh, go ahead.
Hello.
You can hear.
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. Okay. I guess what I wanted to add is, if you're looking at the basic level for how a structure is held together, you have certain things that need to be shared by the people who are involved. So say if you're talking about Catalyst, you have a voting system, and everybody needs to agree that this system is what's going to be used in order to fund the proposals involved. And so like that's a shared protocol basically for how you're interacting with the system. But there's also other things that don't have to be shared, because like there's the different opinions about direction of a project, and there's different ideologies, there's different cultures, and I sort of see this as something that would benefit from being able to have multiple different cultures that interact in the same environment. So you may think of them as separate DAOs, but there's the interaction between them is also something that could be interesting. Like I think of it almost like in an ecosystem. So you've got different organisms that they may be competitive, or they may be working in symbiosis. So I think that sort of structure and that sort of dynamic is something that might be interesting to look at, and how different DAOs or different parts of the DAO would interact with each other.
All right. I think Vincent, you wanted to go next?
Yeah, and actually what Ken says kind of really, really solidifies my thinking here. And what Nori, so going off what Ken, Nori, and Stephen were saying, I think culture is a lot about the people, and people can change. So having the DAO be flexible enough, having these primitives be able to be docked and extended where resources can be shared, I think is going to be really important, right? So if you have a contract that can never be changed or can never be appended, or you end up with ends of a graph, I think of everything in graphs. If you think of these nodes at the end of a graph, like a wallet that can only go one way and can never be pulled from, unless it's by this one mechanism, you'll never be able to get that growth of community. You'll never be able to have a wallet that suddenly gets big, expand into a new group, and fund a new culture, a new ecology over there. So I think that's really important. The idea of whatever the primitives are, there needs to be a set of primitives that allow for this kind of fluid extension. I think that's really important. And then what Randall had said about communication, That's a really interesting thing too. And I think it's one thing that's missing from this list. Communications, things like access to email, who has access to the inbox, who has access to the text messages, who has access to the Discord boards. That's really funnily never covered, but is absolutely critical in everything, right? How do you share, I mean, information, like the actual communications of the team is super important, but that's almost never defined. But it would absolutely be critical, right? It's making sure that people don't feel left out. As far as I know, no one's got a DAO that adds people to Discord. It's, you know, it's a kind of this weird variety of points and clicks and invites and other stuff happening. I don't know. I think there's just some interesting, a lot of interesting things going on there.
Yeah, and you know, this actually, because I was thinking that potentially agile, you know, I don't want to say that we do use it and we do all understand it in a corporate setting, right? But I think what I'm calling to is the concept, the logos behind that hierarchy. And, you know, one thing which I think Stephen raised was that, okay, cool. And Nori, in terms of, you know, breaking away DAOs, is they say, cool, here's a vision, and then we break off to this other vision. And, you know, what you said is, okay, well, there's a communication and no one defines that, right? And that is actually semantics. So one thing I think that, you know, might be worth talking about is what exactly is vision, right? Like if we were to think about that vision in terms of the way we discuss the mission, right? It's being able to see something in the future that we desire, okay? And, you know, then desire comes to some interesting things, like what exactly is desire? And it's like wanting to either do something or for something to happen very strongly, right? So, you know, by talking about the semantics, I think that we can start to uncase some of these things. I mean, certainly the fact that a DAO can break away because of a vision, it means that they have a different idea of where the future is going to be, you know? So, I mean, that's something which I think exploring that space might be interesting. And then also, you know, talking again to the identity, you know, I'm trying to clarify what exactly, you know, whether it be group or individual identity, how exactly is that vision realized, right? It's through mutual understanding. So talking again to communication is that I know something, but I don't know that you know it, okay? And then eventually, you know, you will know that I know that, and I will know that you know that. And those are all separate steps, right? And then it goes on and on and on with different people. So yes, I mean, I definitely think that the communication and the contractual understanding that it's mutual information on the vision is something that we should explore.
I think that that's really important and something we should definitely consider. I have a little bit of a harder problem how to break that into smart contract primitives, if that's what we're really talking about here eventually. And I think it's really interesting to try to figure out how we codify culture and vision into a smart contract, because that's really what we need to get to if we want to include that as kind of a primitive that we can assemble and say. But if the conversation here is about primitives, then maybe that's one specific thing, but there may be another organization that's totally top down and some strong charismatic guy with a vision says, I want to do this, who's with me? And it's not a collaborative kind of hierarchy kind of thing, it's a top down thing. And that may be totally fine, but we should have primitives that allow for that to happen. If we're talking about true primitives, sure, it could be. If everybody votes and likes the personality and continues to support until they fail with the popularity contest, and then it can change. But I just wanted to get back to saying, I don't think we should be afraid of growth and diversity in DAOs and having them split. When they get to a certain size, if they're super successful, we're going to exceed Dunbar's limit. And I think that's a natural forking point for lots of human-sized organizations, is when you get more than 100 people, it's just hard to manage. And you start to hit some of our barriers and blocks. So maybe that's a point at which the community will naturally say, hey, we need to split into 2 or 3 or 7. and that just happens. And we should celebrate that, because that means the ecosystem's diversifying and growing and specializing. And maybe down the road, these two previous splits decide that their missions align more down the road, and they can recombine and do stuff. I think mimicking nature and looking at that, I think that was mentioned earlier, is something. Looking at natural kind of analogs or patterns is also a really good thing to think about. We call ourselves Swarm, and we're kind of through that lens. But I think, yeah, just I would love to talk about like the primitives and how we actually codify on chain all of these kind of ideas. Like we can talk a whole bunch about communication and culture, but if there's no way to really get that into a smart contract, that's where it all comes down to, is this is all smart contract based, decentralized.
Well, here's the cool thing.
So picking up on the ecological analogy, which you just mentioned, Narian, it's also a theme that's mentioned before. I think there's already work being done on this by Singularity DAO in terms of their agent approach towards things, where they're experimenting with ecosystem type templates, if you like. First of all, on the financial level, where they're sending off agents to do financial transactions or certain financial instruments, but also they've got quite ambitious plans, Singularity DAO, in its partnership with Cardano, to take that to governance, and to use agent behavior in an ecological setting, in ecological experiments, if you like, in terms of like the artificial intelligence side, to come up with models on that side, which could be quite interesting, because they could come up with novel primitives that you would expect to come to you couldn't predict. Picking up on Anthony's point about difference between cultures, I tend to think of cultures in a modal sense, in terms of sense of modal, like possible worlds, where you have one culture going off in one possible world and another culture going off in another possible world. They're not generic. The difference can be incompatible. So there's a term in modal logic where you have one possible world and another, and you have an accessibility relation between the two, or you do not have an accessibility relationship between the two. So there's no common vision here. You can't say in one culture, this culture has a vision, or this culture has another vision necessarily. They only have a shared vision if there's an accessibility relationship between the two cultures. This is how cultures aren't necessarily accessible to each other. They can be completely opaque to each other. So that's all I'd say on that.
Wonder, is it a decentralized autonomous organization if there is not a single human operating? Because when I was listening to Anthony, it came to my mind that to me, it's also hard to identify myself or a group and then create an organization based on that. But it would be much easier, at least for me, to identify what needs to be done, or the goal, what needs to be achieved, and you set the primitives or the rules of that thing, of how to achieve that, and metrics and all that stuff. And then it is already that organization. But now the people, us, will decide, do we want to jump on that part or not, or we want to configure that. So I would see a world where we have like thousands of these organizations with 0 people, and then people are just picking and choosing what vision they want to complete or what they want to actually achieve. And here the formation comes. Or I'm getting too...
Well, I think you're totally right. Like there's probably a lot of leaderless organizations that are just funded needs that a community just does, right? So for example, a city might fund a park cleanup, and anybody that's seen cleaning the park, it's like a facial identification system where you get a badge, gets paid for cleaning the park, and they can see all the litter. A bug bounty program is a great example of that, right? So a company can just release bug bounty programs. You never have to compete, but if you can find a bug or you can crack a system, they'll know you're there because you can drop your, your wallet in there or something like that, and then you get paid. I don't know. I think you could totally do that, but I think you have to have that flexibility.
That's awesome. Before you hop in there, Anthony, then I'll hand it over to you. So I'm loving all the energy and all that's going on here. I don't know about other folks. I have to jump off fairly soon. What I would love to do next, because sometimes these conversations can go spinning off into theoretical land. And one thing I'd love to do, if you'd like to join me, is do this in concrete land. So start with an organization that needs a DAO structure. What are the things you're encountering? And then we could all brainstorm on, well, here's one idea you could try. Here's one idea you could try. Here's one idea you could try. So that we get less out of talking about the possibilities and more into, here's a couple ways to solve a concrete problem that one organization is having right now. So that's my thought as to what to do next. I just wanted to throw that out there on the table. And Anthony's up next, and then Vincent.
Cool. So I've got an idea on the concrete side, which I'll talk to now. But one of the things which I think I'm a bit concerned about is this notion that there won't be a hierarchy in a DAO. In almost every case, there will be some sort of hierarchy. Even if we just take a very simple thing as something done and someone can do it, there's already going to be a relationship that is defined there, where you're dictating to the other person what they need to do, right? So, and then in terms of project management, again, sometimes people are just put in a position where they are managing a team, they're not actually doing the work, right? They're thinking more about sort of the why than the how. And, I like trying to divorce ourselves from hierarchies, even though that's something that, is done in corporates. I'm just trying to visualize like a system that kind of works without hierarchies, and I can't, right? So I don't know if you guys have a better idea on that front, but I can't see that. And also according to the fact that some people are followers, they're just that way inclined, right? But coming to the concrete thing, one thing which I thought of, which would be calling to what I was talking about earlier, is that mutual understanding is something that hasn't been, I don't see something in the market. It's like, as you said, I know something and I can publish that. And if someone can say that they know that I know that and that they know that, that's something you could put into a smart contract, right? It's a piece of information that you can hash and you can say, yes, I agree with that. I mean, not even just that I know it. You could then say, I know it, and then I either agree or disagree with it, right? That's another piece of information. And then, you could say, well, I like that Anthony, because it might be even another piece of information. We say, okay, well, I like that Anthony knows that and that he agrees with it, or I like that he knows it and he disagrees with it. And now them saying that to me, I now know that they know that's about me. And so we then can start to develop vision, right? Mutual understanding, developing vision. And from there, we can then construct DAOs. So that's something that's quite concrete.
Vincent, you're up if you're.
Sure. I feel bad that primitives got so. I'm always bad about plugging. I don't like plugging my own ideas. But since we talked a lot about primitives, I did do a proof of concept with a single type of primitive. It's an actor resource model, right? So you have an actor, you have a function, a lambda function, you have a resource. With that, I've shown as a proof of concept, you can do things like election systems. And you can get really cool voting behavior that can be passed through like attention model. You can get like vectors of votes and do all, anytime you have a vector of numbers, you can do all kinds of cool stuff with selections and things. So I posted a GitHub link in the chat, and I put a Python notebook in Miro. It's like this itsy bitsy thing. If you go there, you can see, I don't know if it should just show up. You should just be able to see it on GitHub. You can see that via these very concrete deterministic primitives, you can get via the agent, via the voter, the stakeholder, non-deterministic behavior out of the system, right? So You don't know how people are going to vote, but you know how if they vote a certain way, it'll produce a certain result. So I showed that for like an election system, but I don't know. I think it would be really fun to start sketching out what these little actor resource or these little contract objects would look like. That's standard. And then trying to construct these practices that you're labeling, right? Like let's try to construct a million monkey, or let's try to construct, I think that'd be really cool, right? Because then we can look at it. And the nice thing about the reason I did it the way I did was that these primitives are inherently, they have enough metadata within them to pull out a visualizable graph that is then amenable to graph proofs, right? So you can get directionality if you want to add directionality, stuff like that. So you can actually prove out the system as you would have, you can do like breadth first searches, and you can check trees and stuff like that and all that fun junk. I don't know if anybody's willing to do that and they could put issues into that GitHub. I'm happy to do it in other languages. I know a few, or sketches or anything like that. I'd be super excited to do little powwows about how we can take these very baby primitives and then build out these slightly more complicated primitives that can then be composed into these more interesting actual use cases. Elections, it just turns out, are super unnervingly simple. I think it's actually a really bad thing to look at because they're too simple. Whereas something like a million monkey is much more involved, much more complicated because you have oracles and stuff. How do you do oracles and things like that? Really cool stuff.
I'll just say real quick, and then unfortunately I have to drop and I'm hosting this stuff, so I apologize. It's a great conversations going on here, but I'll start up a Discord channel, and maybe we can solicit like one thing that we want to solve for next week, or one thing that we want to pull some concrete ideas around for next week. And then let's figure out some of this stuff offline.
Thanks for hosting, Pete.
Yeah, no, thank you all for joining, and great conversations and topics, and please feel free to continue without me. I think Thibaut actually owns the recording right now, so as long as Thibaut's here, it'll keep going. All right. Yeah, I'll have a weekend.
Vincent, I really love this project, and I think this is the level of stuff that I would love to see happen, is actual like primitives with the code of how it would work kind of laid out. So then we can actually start to assemble things and say, here's a little toy DAO, let's play with it and see if we can accomplish a task or vote on how we spend the treasury or something like that, and kind of find out where the issues are. And I think there's a lot of prior art that we should also be looking at through Aragorn and all these other DAOs on the Ethereum blockchain, because they've had years of head start, and there's a lot of activity going on, and there's probably lessons learned and things to adopt from there. So we won't have to invent everything from scratch, but I do like the direction of this kind of thing. I think it's an actual kind of hands-on, build it out, experiment, iterate, and the code actually documents the intent, which I love. It's not just semantic words that you can confuse saying, oh, I thought you meant this. The code doesn't lie, it's just there, and it's going to execute the same way no matter who runs it. So I think that's the level I would love to get to. I also wanted to just go back to Anthony really quick. Some other models of having non-hierarchy, you might want to check out a book called Reinventing Organizations. It talks kind of a little bit about heel level organizations based around holacracy. I don't think every DAO should be built that way. I agree. DAOs are probably first going to be economic entities that replace corporations. And a lot of the roles within a corporation are going to transfer over the same way. You're still going to need a team of people building things. You're going to need project managers to make sure it does the right, follows the schedule and is laid out. You're going to need marketing people to make this thing successful. You're going to need people managers to help develop people and make sure that they're operating at their best and growing and learning. I think a lot of those roles will translate into DAOs, or certain types of DAOs. There may be others that are pure teal level holacracies where you have circles and link leads and all these other things where it's different, but I think it's still comfortable enough that a lot of DAOs will probably look like a lot of corporations today. It's just, there's going to be other primitives that enhance it. It'll be like Corporation Plus. You'll be able to say, I don't agree with this vision. Here's another proposal. And then the group members can vote on it. And the way we assign and dictate what we're going to do will be much more democratic. It's not going to be like the senior management team deciding this is what we're focusing on this quarter, and here are our OKRs, and here's our objectives. And I think there's an opportunity to change that, but I don't see all of those roles going away, at least not in the first couple of iterations for most DAOs, because they're comfortable, we know how they work. And if we're going to have a successful economic entity, we can't be stumbling through everything or it's just going to fail and people are going to lose heart. So I think there's going to be a blend, and then eventually we'll develop into something new as we get more and more tools.
So I mean, one thing which I think that I don't know if we can do it. Can we find, like, because corporate's like an easy use case, right? That we all kind of know. Can we identify like 2 other use cases that are vastly different that provide
Games.
Okay.
Games.
Games.
I just I used to create a MMORPG game, and there is like a lot of choices where you have to make, like, if you create a weapon, what kind of weapon, what attributes it has, and and how it affects the entire system. Like if you and this is much more complicated when I compare it with the ERP systems I now help to build. So just to answer your question.
So yeah. If we could find that list, and then we can, when we talk of the primitives, to put it in those contexts, to say, well, does this work and does this apply? To be honest, I kind of feel that it's not just a case of that we're mimicking what, the current system, like capitalism, how it's going about, but more likely that will probably, that's kind of probably human nature, and it probably will work like that more than likely. In terms of like calling though to a more democratized approach, I forget who was saying this. I think it was you, Nori, who said kind of like, there's a DAO, they break away and remerge. One thing I don't like about the corporate capitalistic structure is that you have these hierarchies, but their efforts are siloed. I mean, even in open source projects, right? You'll have their efforts are siloed, like they're trying to solve the same problem, but by the very nature of the programming language they pick or the libraries that they use underneath it, the efforts become siloed, right? So certainly one thing I would like to see of a DAO is that you can break away your vision, and it's not like a hard fork, that actually we could say, well, I just want to work on it slightly different, not to pull away from the momentum, and that we can remerge, that we there's not a complete divorce of those communities. And also allowing for a mechanism where you can imagine 2 communities that maybe started in different directions and somehow merged, and then there was some mechanism or process by which that was easy. It was like, oh, our visions align. Oh, let's do it, And it's the system that guides it, not that I have to, as an individual, go and meet someone and say, hey, our visions align, and then have a meeting. It should just sort of be like, okay, well, my vision's that way, that vision's their way, and then there's a Venn diagram that somehow says, well, you should actually start working together and collaborating. That's something I'd like to see.
I think something I was thinking about earlier, like if you're looking at how cultures are formed. Do you hear me?
Yes, but can you raise your hand, because Brenda has been waiting for also quite a while.
Sorry.
I was just going to point out that for those of you who may not have been following the Miro board, some of the things we're talking about right now, with this sense of what the group thinks is true and what the values are of the group, like that's all super relevant in my estimation. And like I've got a list of at least 9 items that we've talked about more or talked about less attached to this big red note in that Miro board. And it's there for you to see. Go ahead, Ken.
Sorry, Ken, are you talking? You're on mute.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, one thing, funny enough.
Sorry, so could I just, I just like to go back to one point on that Norrie raised actually in relation to Vincent as well on the GraphScope DAO. And I'd just like to echo that point. It'd be great to see some sort of group or workshop working with that. So if you'd like to do some sort of session, Vincent, I'd be definitely interested in taking part with a hands-on session with that, if Norrie is interested as well. I think that'd be a great exercise in understanding graph approaches. I'm always, because I'm not so familiar, I only have a superficial knowledge of directed acyclic graphs and how to use that. And it would be great to have a session, if you're up for it, Vincent, to go through that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm not going to say I'm a graph expert either. It just happens to be I like to think in pictures like that. I don't know how is the best way to schedule stuff like that, so we're all over the place.
I like that idea, and I just want to point out that from my perspective, it's all very abstract unless we're talking about particular use cases. And so just drawing the attention back to that big red sticky that has all those gold stickies around it. I think those are relevant use cases that might make it more accessible when we talk about that. Does that make sense?
I mean, we could either arrange a meeting, just a meeting in the week, or we could make it a swarm session, if you like, next week.
I can do middle week.
Or when Norrie's free as well.
You mind if I just send you guys a message on Discord, connect you there if you're not?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
great.
There's like a scheduling app. Oh man, I am so behind the times and stuck on Slack. I forgot how it works. But there's like an app where people can put like dates and times, and people can just click in and say when they're available. Does anybody remember what that is? It's a thing, I promise.
Google Calendar.
You can't propose times in Google Calendar, though, can you?
No.
You can propose a new time, but you can't see when people are available unless they share your calendar public or something. I can't remember.
Yeah.
So
Calendly uses like you can kind of aggregate the data, and I think even the straw poll has these calendar options.
Calendly, no, TiVo, thank you. That's it. That was the one.
I wonder, like, is the problem, does it has to be complicated, or if we take it like a simple one, let's say, let's create the proposal and everybody has to write the paragraph of something, and then we vote each other on the paragraph and or person who writes it, and or this is too small and it has no result on showing how effectively we wrote the proposal itself.
I think that's the problem with doing things that small, because that sounds like people sharing documents on GitHub. You know, so because it does really, no. Because with Secret Dex, we collaborate on documents all the time, and we don't vote. We just edit something. We even edit over things, and then we have comments within the documents, which then are it's a bit like a version of Google Documents, but on steroids. You know, and so, but I suppose the point of judgment you need to make, TiVo, is at what point, what becomes complex enough to make it worth voting on? Maybe that's the question.
Yeah. In another session we had in this town hall, actually, after town hall, there was one person who advocated for the best system is where you vote the less, but like the least amount of times. So if we are talking about DAOs and these systems where we constantly keep voting to decide what, where, and we going, then
yeah, Daniel Ospina, who I talked to about his experience with SourceCred, and he's done quite a lot of SourceCred stuff. He says that they have this problem of voter fatigue because they're constantly having to vote to keep up with each other's contributions. And after a while, the voting becomes the work. You know, it becomes the work of tracking people's contributions, but almost outweighs the contributions that you're tracking. You know, so it's a real problem.
And funny of calling to that, you know, I thought the interesting thing is that when you're creating a decentralized system, like the way I think of it is that when you're trying to program something and you hire a contractor, right? There is extra overhead to have that contractor be part of your work pipeline, right? And but those communications are necessary and they have to be concrete. And the interesting thing, you know, calling to this ability to vote is that it kind of calls this idea that if there is work to be part of the system, then that's still work. And, you know, those are considered overhead. And I definitely think to some extent the DAO is going to need to automatically create contracts. So, you know, for example, if I were to, you know, have a conversation with someone, is there would be some sort of trusted artificial intelligence that kind of picks up what we're saying and then actually goes about. I can't hear a thing.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so there's an overhead basically. There's an overhead to the system that you implement, and that needs to be considered. I think whenever we do it. And another thing, calling to doing something concrete, is one thing I'm starting to pick up, at least in the conversation here, is that we've actually defined the vision to some extent. I think we're all in agreement here, and we want to get stuck into the how, right? But we've got all these boards. Like, why don't we take it as a session where we actually put that into a document, start creating the entities? But like, you know, this here is the starting spec basically. I don't think we have to get too complicated. We've already discussed it, you know. There's a lot of good stuff on this board. I've just been reading it like as we've been talking, and I would like to explore these spaces.
Looking at Vincent's GitHub repo, there's things for actions and graphs and actors and stuff. If we want to start there, it'll probably be good to say, what can we build with the primitives that exist, and use that as a starting point and say, okay, this is what's possible. Where do we want to add on so we can do a slightly bigger thing and model that out and grow? My fear is if we start with something that's way outside of what he has already, then we're going to have to spend a whole bunch of time trying to figure out how to model that, how to create things, rather than growing what's already there. Just coming from a software development background, you can have a new feature that the stakeholder thinks is a really small incremental thing, but it requires a complete backend rewrite. So I want to avoid that situation where we're doing something that is good intentions, but will create a whole lot of work to get to that point. It might be nice to just evolve what's here and start going into different directions of what's possible based on the current existing stuff. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, which I agree with. But then I think that, you know, that's calling to a backlog, right? So we need to have a look at this board and then say, well, how do we expand it from here? And what is the next most important thing to expand into?
Totally agree with that. I'm just saying, I don't understand what's possible with the current thing. I imagine it's a very small set of, here's an activity we want to achieve, here's who's doing it, here's how we decide. Like, I need to go through this code in more detail. It looks like Python.
I mentioned the first session. Yeah, I agree, Nori. I think the first session with Vincent would be like more of a learning thing, like learning the ropes of his system. You know, I mean, you can read as much as you want, but it'd be nice to see some demonstrations and some back and forth. So that's how I sort of see. Well, that's how I'd like to see the first session, and then we can move on. I agree with Nori. Absolutely, keep it simple. Start from there, and then build with some basic primitives that we can play with.
Just jump in real quick. Vincent, you sent me a direct link. Can you send me your Discord, or can you ping me on Discord? And maybe you want to resend that link to everyone. Oh, you just did. There you go.
I did, but it's wrong. It doesn't have times. I feel like I failed and I wanted to delete the message, but I can't.
All right.
Oh man, I suck at. Yeah. Okay. So this has no times on it. It just has days, which is useless. So I failed.
It's okay. You can do it again. That's fine.
And Stephen, I agree with what you said. Learning is important. I get the best learning from looking at particular use cases. And I'll stop saying the word use case now because I've said it 3 times.
When I've lost the management URL for this, that's so exciting.
Yeah. I mean, the
Oh, here we go.
And while we have a pause, I'll just return to something somebody else said, Nori, about reusing what's already there. What's surprising to me is how little is already there. Lots of the DAOs that we see, oh, you just go make a DAO. And all it is a stakeholding DAO. It's not decision making. It's not like all this other stuff, unless I totally got it wrong and I've missed something.
My understanding is there are on-chain voting mechanisms where DAO members can make a proposal and then everybody votes on it. And if it's approved, then the Treasury releases the funds to that proposal. I think those definitely exist.
I think Dor listed them in one of the recent town halls. There was a slide where he listed the DAOs that he saw out there. And there's only about 6 or 7 or 8 of them. That were, as Nori was saying, they were kind of on-chain voting systems. They were quite small, very small. That's what Dor emphasized. They were very small, like below in the hundreds at most of people. Even the biggest one only had about 600 people or something in them. And
of course, not on Cardano.
Not on Cardano. I think definitely on the Ethereum chain. So yeah.
What you have to have smart contracts.
I'm sorry, but I remember I saw somebody posting, was it YDevo, a link about the blockchain experiment that just did the switch from to decentralized being a DAO, and there was a whole Twitter feed. So I'm not sure if or it was that someone else. I'm not sure, but it was recently posted. And it was very interesting because indeed, I don't know any other big projects that try to actually do it and not just talk about it.
I'm on a mailing list for DAO House, and they do have a library of primitives that you can use, I believe. I may be getting that mixed up with the second project, but almost every example I've seen is on the Ethereum blockchain. So it's worth looking there and subscribing and listening to podcasts, because there is a whole bunch of DAO activity that goes back years. So I think there's lots of lessons learned and definitely concrete examples that we should be learning from.
I'm as much interested in I'm more interested in the learning than I am in this is already working on some other blockchain.
Well, that is learning, right? I mean, looking at how they're doing it on the other blockchains and seeing what's going on, how it's being used, what situations, perhaps a use case could be pulled from that learning, which I'll call exploration.
That's the point. And I want to just revisit something somebody else said about lightening the load of decision making, and like to the extent that we could make it feel like you're not voting, but that you're expressing something with like the lightest possible interaction, so it doesn't feel like decision making. It just feels like you're contributing to the momentum of what people think. That's a really powerful idea to me.
A passive voting, a type of passive voting based on action, or
Maybe a combination of passive or implied, that if you're doing activity on it, it implies some momentum coming from you. Yeah, that's an interesting angle. Mostly, I was just thinking of like reducing the number of formal interactions and increasing the number of times that yeah, maybe implicit or maybe a tiny explicit in workflow kind of thing where you're saying, yeah, that.
Ken?
Yeah.
I think that goes along the lines of what I was trying to say before, like in cultural interactions, it has to do with what people share in a conversation or in a group. So you can have on a small scale, like just two individuals that are friends and know each other. They'll maybe have interactions with each other that might not be understood with other people in other groups. And if you have a system set up where you have those interactions where it's groupful, so like where people may have shared interest and shared understanding on the topic, and so that they're already working on something related to the specific topic that they're talking about, and so it's pretty easy for them to maybe to go on some direction related to that topic. But also, if you have random interactions in the system as well, so like a percentage of interactions where you have people from different groups that are coming together so that they can like create bonds, or maybe have people see what they're doing and then direct them to someone else that they might have had interactions with in the past. And so I just sort of see it as, if you're trying to keep track of the entire system, that's where you sort of get tired with trying to just track everything. Like you don't if you have the system set up in a way so that it's giving people opportunities to interact a certain percentage in what they know already, and then maybe a small percentage in something they don't know to sort of bridge gaps. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. Rick?
Well, for me, I just came on to a thought, because if you say the question of how can we increase voter participation and engagement, even with people who might not be really that interested in a DAO, if you then would say for the funding, let's just assume that we take, and every proposal that gets funded, 5% of their revenue is actually going to be distributed amongst all the voters. So you then give money to proposals, and people will then say, hey, if I vote, and the proposals, if I actually do good work, and the proposals become successful, the better successful they are, the more money they generate. So the more I will earn as well, because every voter becomes a minority stakeholder. If you have 5%, that way you can actually say, well, all that work of voting, why are you doing it? Well, first of all, to increase our DAO. Second of all, to increase your wallet. So the better you do it with the more engagement, the better quality proposals will be funded, the more money you will make. So try making an effort. It's just something that popped up as some sort of alternative. I haven't actually seen anything like that, but yeah, just wanted to share it.
Yeah. We have today explored a quite vast majority of the ecosystem, and I would like to start finishing it up in this 10-minute mark. Do we have any closing thoughts, or I shall close the recording and then we can have the closing thoughts afterwards?
Thank you, Sigo. I'm out of thoughts.